Thank you very much, Brock. It is a real pleasure for me to be with you. When Brock called me several months back and asked me about coming, I had not done any kind of seminars like this before. I've spoken a number of times on grief, and it really came partly out of writing a book called Beyond the Valley of Death. Just to give you a little bit of background about my life without going too deep into it, 28 months ago yesterday we buried my wife, 28 months ago. There are days, and many of you, so if you feel comfortable, raise your hand if you've lost a spouse, if you feel comfortable, if you've lost a child, if you've lost a parent. So every person in here has lost somebody who you're close to. And you will understand this, that after 28 months, there are days that it seems like it was yesterday. The most difficult days are anniversaries. So 28 months ago, yesterday we buried my wife. There are other days it seems like it's been 28 years instead of 28 months. So our emotions change often, and we're going to talk about that today. So I was asked to present a lesson for a church, actually over in Lawrence County, Alabama, online back during COVID. They were doing a special series, and they asked if I would present a sermon about losing your spouse, and I did that, and several people said, why don't you write that and put it in a book? And so we agreed to do that. It took about a year to get all the material together and to get my mind where I thought it should be. And I'm still not sure after writing the book that it was where I thought it should be. Brock made the statement a minute ago, Jeff has an understanding of grief, and I want to confess to you, I don't think I understand it very well, even now, but we're learning as we go. And so what we're going to do today, hopefully, is to talk a little bit about grief and about losing people who are close to us. And as Brock said, if you have questions, please feel free to ask. We'll take those questions at the end of this session. I'm a preacher by nature. I would rather this not be like a sermon, but that's going to be difficult. I've been preaching for 45 years, and so I'll try my best not to make it like a sermon, but hopefully make it practical. And Brock also said that, I don't think Brock used these words, but I want you all to know that you're like guinea pigs for me today, because I've never presented all of this material together, and I would love to get feedback from you. And I have really tough skin. I've been a preacher for 45 years, and I've got a lot of criticism through the years, and so I'm okay with that. So if you hear something you think that wasn't very helpful, that didn't seem to do any good, I would love to know. If you want to write it down, you don't have to sign your name, or if you'll just tell me. Or if you hear something you think that was really good, I wish everybody could hear that, I would love to know that as well, because we're going to be doing a number of these. The first session is called When Life and Grief Hits Us Hard, and it's based on James chapter 1. James begins this book by talking about the fact that trials and tribulations are a part of life. And there are two statements he makes in the beginning of his writing. And one is that trials and tribulations are inevitable. Every person will go through trials in life. And every person's trials are different. Our trials are not all the same. Our tribulations are not all the same. I have a friend in Oklahoma who lost her husband and 2 sons in a plane crash at the same time. Her life changed forever. I have a friend who is a preacher in Texas who lost his father through a tragic accident, and then he lost his 4-year-old son within the same year. Everybody's trials and tribulations are different, but everybody has trials and tribulations. And if you haven't been through trials in your life, if you were to say, I've never had trials in my life, I would say one of two things. Either you are so old you've forgotten, or you're too young to have had trials yet. But everybody will go through trials. So trials and tribulations are inevitable. And number 2, this is a big one. God can use every trial that we have in life to make us grow deeper in our faith. He can use every trial that we face in life to help us grow deeper in our faith. Every event that is difficult in life, you either become better from it or you become bitter. You either grow in your faith or your faith is a little bit weaker. We get to make the choice. The beauty of what God does with humanity is He allows us to make the choice whether we're going to become bitter or whether we're going to become better. He doesn't force that on us. He allows us to make the choice whether we're going to allow Him to use what has happened in our life to help us grow deeper in our faith, or is our faith going to become weaker? So here's what I say. Either you will become deeper in your faith or you'll become weaker in your faith. Either you will become bitter or you will become better. And so those are the two big takeaways from the book of James. And then I want to share today, in the next little bit, 5 things that I wish every person knew about grief. Now, this list may not be comprehensive, and I would love to hear if you know something that is not on my list. I would love to hear what you have to say about that. And this is my list. I compiled it not only through my own experiences, but with the help of other people. I think I could have turned it into a list of 50 things, but we tried to kind of boil them down and put them into 5 simple things that I wish everybody knew about grief. Number 1, sometimes you feel like you're going crazy. Now, that's not a biblical statement. That did not come from the Bible. But sometimes when you suffer grief in your life, you feel like you're going crazy. You may, after my wife passed away, after a little bit of time passed, I would be driving down the interstate in Dallas. Interstate 35 is one of the busiest roads in the country. And sometimes you get stuck in traffic there, and I would always listen to the radio. And I would hear a song on the radio that was one of my wife's favorite songs, and I would literally have to pull off the side of the road because I couldn't see because I was crying so much just from hearing that song. And it comes up sometimes without any warning. You may see something, you may remember something, you may hear something that was familiar to you and to your wife, that was special to you and your wife. My wife's favorite singing group was the Eagles. We grew up in the 70s, and if you don't know who the Eagles are, I hope God will forgive you for that. But we grew up in the 70s, and we loved the Eagles and James Taylor, and I took her to about 7 different Eagles concerts during the nearly 40 years that we were together. And so that triggers something in my mind. And so there'll be times in life that you feel like you're going crazy. And so why does grieving feel like you're going crazy? And there are 5 ways that it affects you. Number 1, it affects you emotionally. Emotionally. When we talk about emotionally, we talk about things like despair and numbness and fear and irritability and weeping and sorrow, and all of those are what we would call negative emotions. And that's what, when you're grieving and you feel like you're going crazy, it's because you might not be a negative person. I'm not by nature a negative person. I think I'm a positive person. I grew up that way, and I've been that way all my life. But it affects you emotionally. It causes you to think in ways that you might not think before. It causes you to feel ways that you might not have felt before. Number 2, what I would call behaviorally. Some people go through social withdrawal. Some people have disrupted sleep, restlessness, again, crying at unexpected times. You do things that you thought you never would do. I have 3 grandchildren. I have a granddaughter who's the oldest. She is 11. I have a grandson who is 9, and I have a grandson who is 4. They live about 2.5 hours from where I live. And oftentimes I go up to visit them in their home. And when I go, I usually stay in a hotel. The reason I stay in a hotel is because they have too many kids there and not enough beds. They don't have a room for me. They've got animals all over the place. They live out in the country. They have dogs, and they have bees, and they have hamsters, and they have chickens, and they're running around all over the place. And so they just don't have room for another human being in the house. So I get a hotel. So I would let my grandchildren come and stay with me in the hotel, give the parents a break, and I would enjoy my grandchildren. My youngest grandson, who just turned 4, before he turned 4, he would say, "Pops, I can't stay with you." And I said, "Why not, Forrest? Why can't you stay with me?" And he said, "Because I'm not old enough." And I said, "How old do you have to be before you can stay with me?" He said, "I have to be 4. And when I'm 4, I can stay with you." So we had his 4th birthday, and I went up there to see him, and he said, "Pops, I'm 4, I can stay with you now." So we went to the hotel. The older kids were in school. We got to the hotel. We got our keys. We went up to the floor. Our key didn't work. The second key didn't work. We went all the way back down, got 2 more keys. The first key didn't work. The second key didn't work. He said, "Pops, what are we going to do?" I said, he said, "Do we have to go back down?" I said, "No, we'll call the front desk. They'll send a maintenance man up here, and he'll open the door for us." So we waited. The maintenance man never showed up. Finally, the maintenance guy, I see him coming around the corner. I said, "Forrest, what are we going to do when that maintenance guy gets here?" He said, "Pops, I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm going to punch him in the face." I said, "Forrest, we can't punch him in the face." I said, "That's not what Jesus would want us to do." And I said, and Christians don't punch people in the face. And I think about behaviorally, sometimes I want to punch people in the face when they say the wrong thing or they do the wrong thing. And so I tried to have this little lesson with my little 4-year-old, and he said, "Pops, I'm not a Christian yet. I'm going to punch him in the face." so I guess part of me, I was going, yes, that's what I want to do too, you know. But behaviorally, we do things that are not who we are. That's not the way we think. That's not the way we act. And so it causes all kinds of feelings about, am I going crazy? Number 3, it affects us cognitively. It affects us cognitively. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, it affects the way our mind works. And so we are, there might be feelings of forgetfulness. We might forget important things. We might forget things that are minor. We might lose track of time. Loss of concentration. I don't think I can do this. I had a lady in our congregation who lost her husband just a few months ago, and she called me and she was just frantic. And she said, "I'm supposed to get all of the insurance papers." And she said, I've known where the insurance papers are, but I've forgotten. And she said, "I can't find the insurance papers." And she said, "I don't think I can do this." And I said, "Let me get a couple of the ladies, and they'll come over, and you tell them, you think about where you might have put those papers, and they'll help you find them." Well, they did, but this affected her so deeply that she couldn't remember where she put the insurance papers. Now, you might think, well, that's not a big deal. Well, if you lose a spouse and you've got to get those papers to even get like a death certificate, that is a huge deal. And so we even forget things. The way that we think is different. And then number 4, it affects us physically. It affects us physically. Some people go through times of more frequent illness. People lose their appetite. When my wife passed away, I lost, over a period of a year, I lost 20 pounds. Now, I needed to lose 20 pounds. I needed to lose more than that. But I lost 20 pounds because there were times I just didn't want to eat. I couldn't make myself eat. And my daughter would call me she lives in Oklahoma, and my son lives up in New York. And they would call and they'd say, "Dad, are you eating?" And I would just say, "Well, I'm trying. So it affects you physically. It affects you physically also. Some people lose, they sleep too much. Some people sleep too little. I have a friend who lost her husband, and she said, "I can't even get out of bed." I can't make myself get out of bed. And so grief affects us all in different ways, and we'll say more about that. And then the fifth thing that I've written down is that it affects us spiritually. It affects you spiritually. So if you've lost somebody close to you, and you've thought in your mind, why did God let this happen? You're not the only person. You need to know that you're not the only person who has felt that. I know that I asked God numerous times not to let my wife die, numerous times. And then when she died, I asked God many times, why did you let my wife die? Now, I know that is a theological kind of question that there is no answer to for many people. It is a question that many people have in their minds. Why did God let this happen? My wife suffered with cancer off and on for 25 years. The first time that she battled cancer was 25 years before she passed away. They thought they got it all. It came back 10 years later. They thought they got it all. It came back 10 years after that. Actually, it was 35 years that she suffered with cancer off and on. And the last time they couldn't do anything. We went to Mayo Clinic in Arizona. We talked to the people at MD Anderson in Houston, and they said there's nothing else that we can do. My wife was not a perfect person, because I know that nobody is, but she was as close to a perfect person as anybody I've ever known. And I don't understand to this day why she left us as early as she did. She was 58 years of age. I've known people who've lost mates earlier than that. I've known some who've had mates who've lived. I have some friends who recently celebrated their 73rd wedding anniversary, 73 years together. There are times that you think, why did God allow this to happen? And if you do that too long, if you start questioning God, what is going to happen is that your faith is not going to become deeper, your faith is going to become weaker. And so you put all of these together, you put these 5 aspects together, spiritual, the physical, the cognitive, the behavior, and the emotion, and you put all of these changes that occur when you lose somebody close to you, and you put you mix all of this in together, and guess what? Sometimes you feel like you're just going crazy. Sometimes you feel like you're going crazy. And that's okay, because that's a part of the grief experience. And no wonder people feel like they're going crazy, especially when they don't know that what they're experiencing is a normal part of grief. A normal part of grief. I've had people ask me, is it okay for me to feel this way? Well, yes, it's okay, because that's the way you feel. You can't command feelings. You can command action. You can command behavior. You can say you've got to do this, but you can't tell somebody you can't feel this way. I've thought about this through the years when I've done marriage counseling with people who've gone through divorce, and somebody says, well, this is the way I feel, and their mate says, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Well, that's really helpful, isn't it? No, that doesn't help anybody at all. You can't command the way that you feel. And so all of these different aspects of I feel like I'm going crazy, all of these aspects are a normal part of grief. And sometimes they will last a short period of time, but sometimes they may last a lot longer period of time. And so what can we do? What can we do when we feel that way? A couple of things. Number one, understand that this is a normal part of grief. Understand it is a normal part of grief. Number two, be willing as best you can to talk to people about what you are dealing with. Talk to somebody about what you are dealing with. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later on about things that people say to us when we go through a period of grief that are not usually very helpful. And a lot of people you can't talk to because they have no way to understand what you're dealing with. One of the things we often say is that every person's grief is different. And even if you've suffered the same kind of loss that somebody else has suffered, your grief is not going to be the same. And so there's no set way that this has to be done. There's no formula. But one of the things that we can do is find somebody who is willing to talk, somebody who is willing to listen. I have a good friend who is a preacher, and he says that preachers talk way too much and don't listen enough. And he said that every person has a story. Every person has a story. And I know that in this room today, every person has some story. And we need to be able to tell our story to people. We need to be able to share what we've experienced in life with people. Number two, grief is never the same. The big point, number two, grief is never the same. This is number two under 5 things I wish everybody knew about grief. It is never the same. We buried my mother on Christmas Eve, 2005. I have a good friend in the Dallas area where I live who he buried his mother on Christmas Eve 2005. We buried our mothers the same day. And we talked about together after I got back from Birmingham where we had the funeral. And he said, "How's your dad doing?" So we talked a little bit about our dads. And we would do that through the years. We'd talk about how our dads were doing. So when my mother passed away, all the children were there. We had the funeral on Christmas Eve. There was nowhere to go eat dinner. My dad didn't want to eat at the house. And so we finally found, got to be late at night, so we finally found a Waffle House that was open. And all the family had dinner at Waffle House that night. Nikki, something happened that night that surprised me that wasn't common with my dad. He paid for everybody's meal. My dad believed that when I got to be 15, my dad believed I was able to take care of myself then. And so I started paying for stuff. And, when I got ready to go to college, my dad told me where he wanted me to go to college. And he said, "No, you got to pay for it, So I said, "Well, if I'm paying for it, I get to decide where I go. If you pay for it, you can tell me where to go." But anyway, I ended up going where he wanted me to go anyway, because I thought I had to do what my dad said, even though he wasn't paying for it. But we went to Waffle House, and we got to the house that night, and it was late. And my dad said, "I want to talk to y'all before we go to bed." So we thought, okay, so we all got together. And he said, "I can't sleep in that bedroom tonight the way it is. So I want y'all to take everything out of that bedroom and swap it, the other bedroom, move it in here. And I want all of the clothes out of the closet, and I want all the jewelry out of the drawers and everything." So we stayed up very late doing all of that. My dad didn't want anything that reminded him of my mom. Now, what I've come to learn is that I'm not sure that was the best thing, but it may have been the best thing for him. I was told by many people, don't make any big decisions right after you've lost your spouse or after you've lost somebody close to you. But my dad, that's the way he was. My friend Brian came to me a couple of years, actually it was 5 years, and he said, "You told me about your dad wanting to get everything out of the house, everything out of the room." And he said, "My dad has not touched a thing in our house in 5 years. He said the Christmas tree is still in the den that was up 5 years ago, and it's still up today." And he said, "We got to figure out what we're going to do. We think we're going to have some kind of intervention." My point of telling you that story is that no grief is the same. And if we try to pigeonhole grief and we try to make everybody deal with grief in the same way, we're going to cause a lot of problems, a lot of chaos. But everybody's grief is different. And because everybody's grief is different, then we can't make people act the same way. It's impossible to make people act the same way. So what are the variables? Well, there are many variables when I think about that people have to deal with when it comes to handling grief. And variables are things like, if you think about a spouse, how long have you been married? And so some people have been married 50 years, some people have been married just a few years. How strong was your marriage? Was your marriage a strong marriage? Were you happy in your marriage? And so every different variable, like how long have you been married? How strong was your marriage? What kind of relationship do you have with your children? Are you able to communicate? Do you have friends in your life? What is your relationship like with the Lord? What is your relationship like with people in the church? And so all of these are variables that have to be dealt with, and they are different with every person. And the reason that grief is different for everybody is because people have different variables. It's the same with, like, if you lose a child. How old was the child? My wife and I lost a son when he had only lived for 20 minutes. And he just didn't develop, his lungs didn't develop enough to keep him alive. And where we were living, they didn't have the kind of doctors they have now and equipment where they could have kept him alive. There was just no way to do that. That was 20 minutes. Another friend of mine, I've known people who have lost their grown children. I think about my wife's parents were both alive when they lost their daughter. And, you know, we often say you shouldn't have to bury your children because that's one of the variables that causes a lot of pain and a lot of heartache. And so there are a lot of questions that have to be dealt with, and they're different with every person, and that's why we say that no grief is the same. Our grief is never the same. And that brings me to the third thought, and the third thought is there is no perfect way to handle grief. There's no perfect way to handle grief. Every person who deals with grief in one of three ways. Number one, we grieve, and all of us in some way have to think about our own life. Number one, we grieve as people who sin. We grieve as people who sin. And so what this means is that we're not going to always get it right. It's not going to be perfect. Handling grief, there's no perfect way to handle it. Because we're human beings. The Bible says in places like Romans chapter 3, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So we grieve as people who sin. Number two, we grieve as people who are saints. We grieve as people who are saints. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul says about grieving and about losing someone and about being sorrowful. He said, we do not sorrow as people who have no hope. If you're a Christian, there's something different about your grief compared to people who are not Christians. There's a hope that people who are Christians have that people who do not understand Christ do not have. And tomorrow, we're going to talk about this idea of hope and why hope is so crucial to our life. And then the third thing about this is we all grieve as people who suffer. We all grieve as people who suffer. So somebody tell me the words to the shortest verse in the Bible.
Jesus wept.
Jesus wept. Even the perfect, sinless Son of God grieved as a sufferer. And Jesus said that if you're going to be glorified with me, you have to suffer with me. And so every person who has grief in their life, every person who has loss in their life, every person understands something about suffering. We all grieve as sufferers. And the question is, again, will we allow these aspects of grief, whether we think about grieving as somebody who is in sin, as somebody who is a saint, or somebody who is suffering, will we allow this to help us grow in our faith? And that brings me to number 4, and that is, number 4, my relationships have all changed. Or I would say my relationships have all gotten really weird. Things change when you lose a spouse, when you lose a child. And when we lose somebody close to us, whether you think about losing a spouse or you think about losing a child, you also will lose other relationships. Other relationships will change. And it's not always the fault of the people who are in those relationships with us. It's just a part of grief, a part of life. And so why are there some other losses? Well, I wrote down 4 things. Number 1, friends who have helped us during difficult times have to get back to their own lives. Friends who have helped us through difficult times have to get back to their own lives. So I had a friend who called me after my wife passed away every day for probably 3 months. He called every single day for 3 months. And then he quit calling. And I thought, well, that was weird. You all of a sudden quit calling. And then he called me back about a week later, and he said, I guess you noticed I quit calling. And I said, I did. And I said, I wanted to make sure you're okay. And he said, I know there are other people who reach out to you, and I've thought so much about this that it has caused me to have some struggles in my own life, and I've got to get back to my own life. Now that's hit me really hard, that maybe for some reason I was the cause of that. But the point is that there will be people who will gather around us during moments of grief who have to eventually get back to their own life. And it may be people who we were really close to before our mate or our child or our parent died. The second thing that causes relationships to change is that oftentimes the friendships are centered around the person who has passed away. The friendships are often centered around the person who has passed away. On our 30th wedding anniversary, my wife and I went on a cruise to Alaska. We had never been on a cruise before, and she wanted to go to Alaska, so we went to Alaska. And there were 5 other couples from our church family who went with us. 6 couples went to Alaska together. We spent 12 days on a boat together and had the time of our life. And about 3 of those couples, we were friends only because my wife was friends with the woman. The guys, we got along okay, but the women were really close friends. And we got to be really close friends. But when my wife passed away, those friends kept doing things together, but they didn't include me anymore. And I was okay with that. But your relationships change. And if we don't understand that that's going to happen, it can cause a lot of problems with us, and we can have the wrong kind of feelings toward other people. But the truth is, as I think about that, I can't be angry at them, because if it hadn't been for my wife, we probably wouldn't have been friends anyway. You see, she was the reason that we were friends. Number 3, there are new responsibilities that come into our life that make it difficult for us to maintain some relationships. New responsibilities will come into our life. My wife did virtually everything for me. She took care of our house. She took care of my clothes. made sure I had the right clothes all the time. She did everything for me. And I think I honestly did not realize how much she did for me until she passed away. And boy, it hit me hard one day because I was thinking, I don't know how to do this. I don't know what to do. I had a lady, a friend, a woman in our congregation, and she lost her husband, and she said, I don't know how to go anywhere. I never learned directions because my husband drove me everywhere we went. And she said, I don't know what to do. So our responsibilities will change sometimes. Brock mentioned briefly about been preaching at the Louisville Church in Oklahoma, in the Dallas area for the last 17 years. And when my wife passed away, there were a lot of things that changed about my work, about the work that I was doing. And she was highly engaged in the work that I did. And so I determined after a year that I couldn't keep on doing what I was doing. Now, we had a plan in place, my wife and I did, that when I turned 65, that I would step out of doing the local church work and I would travel and do gospel meetings and workshops and seminars and help young preachers and do some mission work. Well, that was going to be when I turned 65. Well, when she passed away, I was 59 at the time. Now I'm 61, and I determined I can't do this for 4 more years. I'm going to have to do this earlier. So we started doing it earlier than we had planned to do. My point is that oftentimes our relationships with people, whether it's family, people who are friends, people even sometimes in the church, our relationships will change, and there might not be anything that we can do about that. And then the last thing I wrote down was that the friendship was never really a give and take relationship. Somebody wrote these words: I'm a very caring person, always present for others. What I discovered in the grieving process is that while my husband was still alive, I had surrounded myself with people who needed me. And when I was unavailable emotionally to them, and I couldn't respond in the way I normally would, they had a lot of resentment. They would say, this has been a long time and you really need to be moving on with your life. If somebody ever says that, then they don't understand what you're dealing with. And we'll talk about a few other things that people say oftentimes that they don't understand. And so my relationships change drastically. And then the fifth thing that we wrote down for this session, the fifth thing is guilt. Guilt is difficult. Guilt is difficult. When you lose somebody close to you, you'll always have questions in your mind. There will always be thoughts about what could I have done different? Did we do enough? What if we wouldn't have made this decision? When we lost our child, we talked about if we wouldn't have lived in this place, if we would have lived in a different place, would that have kept us from losing our little boy? Well, probably not, but you have questions that go through your mind. Is there anything I could have done differently? Did I do enough? Did I talk to my mate enough? Did I tell her enough how much I appreciated her? Did I tell her enough how much I loved her? Did I tell her enough how much she meant to me and what I felt about her? So how do you handle guilt? 4 things. Number 1, learn the difference between true guilt and false guilt. True guilt and false guilt. When people experience guilt, it's oftentimes because they have violated an internalized standard. Let me tell you what I mean by that. When we violate God's word, that can result in true guilt because we've done something against God. But oftentimes when people experience guilt in their life, it occurs when they violate a principle that they've created in their mind or that somebody else has created for them that is not necessarily a biblical principle. So that's why we raise questions. Did I do enough? So how much are you supposed to do? Well, who makes that decision? Could I have done something different? Well, who's going to decide what you could have done different? Well, God doesn't answer those kind of questions. And so that's guilt that is associated with principles that we have created in our own mind or that somebody else has created for us. When my wife was ill with cancer, we had people who kind of put demands on us. And they would say, well, you need to go to this hospital. And if you don't go to this hospital, you're not going to be able to get the help you need. And then we had somebody else who would say, whatever you do, you don't go to that hospital. Well, that's the same hospital. We had people that tell us what kind of water we need to drink. I'll never forget, a woman came to me and she said, brought me a bottle of water and she handed it to me and she said, if your wife will drink this water, it'll heal her. Well, we have to be careful that we don't allow people to create guilt in our hearts because of their expectations, because of what they have come up with that they think is right. And if I had $1 for every secret that somebody has created that will cure cancer, I'd be a rich man today, because everybody has their own ideas about it. And everybody's got a story about how they can prove that their idea works. So the idea is that we've got to figure out how to distinguish between what is true guilt and what is false guilt. And false guilt, that's everybody else's expectations, and even our expectations that we've created in our own mind. True guilt is when we violate a principle that God has given, not a principle that man has given. And that ought to be true about every aspect of our life. That ought to be true about the church in general. In my preaching life, through the years, people have said, well, you can't do that. And I said, why? They said, because I've never known a preacher who has done that before. Well, so what? You have a biblical reason I can't do that? No, I just don't think it's the right thing. So that would bring about false guilt. So you start thinking, well, maybe that guy's right. Well, we create false guilt when we try to live up to other people's expectations and even our own expectations that we've created. True guilt is when we violate a principle that God has given. Number 2, how do we handle guilt? Try to forget about the what-if questions. Try to forget about the what-if questions. If you live in the what-if world, one fellow said, you never get anything resolved. If you live in the what-if world, you never get anything resolved. When my wife was going through treatments, we knew that there were choices that had to be made about what kind of treatment, and there would always be, well, what if we would have done the other treatment? But if you live in that world, you're never going to accomplish anything. And even after you lose somebody, if you live in what if I would have done that or what if I would have done this, you will begin to create this false guilt that we're talking about. And in addition to that, you'll also not get anything accomplished that is meaningful or successful. Number 3, deal with regrets by turning your guilt over to God. Deal with regrets by turning your guilt over to God. Peter said that when Jesus was hanging on the cross, that when they reviled him, he did not revile in return. When they persecuted him, he did not persecute back. But what did he do? He turned it over to the one who judges righteously. And to me, this is the biggest thing that we can do with guilt. For whatever guilt you're dealing with in your life, whether it's guilt that has occurred because you've lost somebody close to you, or guilt that has occurred because of decisions and choices you've made in your life, the very best way to deal with guilt is to turn it over to God. I had a friend, he said one time that he used to lay awake all night worrying about some problem he was dealing with in his family. And he said, I couldn't go to sleep. I stayed awake all night. He said, then it came to me one day, I just needed to pray and ask God to take care of it because he was going to be up all night anyway. Well, thought that's a pretty good idea. So if we can turn our guilt over to God and get it off of our own shoulders, we will be able to be more productive and life can go on. And some of these things are a lot easier for me to stand up here and say than they are for me to do. And so these are ways that we can help ourselves. And then the last thing about this is we must never underestimate the power of God. We must never underestimate the power of God. 28 months ago, we buried my wife. And there are still days that are extremely difficult. I've had people come to me and say, how in the world do you keep going? How do you keep doing the things that you're doing? And I'll make a confession to you. I didn't know when Brock called me about this if I'd be able to get through this or not. And I tell you that because you need to know that whatever you're dealing with in your life, whatever struggles you have, whatever issues that are causing you not to move as quickly as you might want to or others might want you to, it's okay for you to feel however you feel. It's okay. You need to know that. And I need to know that. And the only answer that I know that has allowed me to get through and to keep going is the power of God himself. Paul said in Ephesians chapter 3 in verse 20, there's a power that works within us that will allow us to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ever ask or imagine. So I do believe that God grants us the power to get through situations and to do things that we're not sure that we can do. And I can tell you this, that if you're trying to do it by yourself, it's not going to work. So we must rely upon the power of God. And the reason that God's power will help us is because it reminds us of how much God loves us. It reminds us of how gracious God is to us. It reminds us of how much God is concerned and how much he cares. Well, those are my 5 big keys to what I wish everybody knew about grief. And as I said, you may have other things, and I would love to hear what those are. And I want to, when we get to the next session after our break, I'm going to talk about, first of all, some things that people say to us that maybe are not the best kind of things, and how we can learn not to say certain things to people. And maybe you've got a list of things that you've heard from people, and I'd love to see those as well. So before we take a little break here, I wonder if anybody has any questions about what we've talked about in this first session that you would like to ask. If anybody has any questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, probably got a couple here. Can you go a little more in depth about, or just not more in depth, or maybe, but I struggle myself with the what ifs, and just always reflecting. Do you have any ways to, like practical ways to start winding that down out of my thought process and moving forward from that?
So a couple of things. I would recommend that if you have these what if questions, that you write them down.
Okay.
When they come to your mind, you write down what if this, and write whatever the what if is. And then you write them down, and then you take some time with each one of those and you give an answer to the what if question. And if you can give an answer to the what if question, you know, like, what if I would have done this? Well, what's the answer to that? It might be it would have made no difference.
Sure.
And if that's the answer, that's going to help me know then that I did what I could. And so find an answer to the what if question. And what I would recommend about that is, if you can't come up with an answer, talk to somebody else about it.
Okay.
And get input from other people who you feel close to. So what do you think about this question? What if I would have done this differently? Or what if we would have made this decision? Or what if we would have made this choice? The problem with the what if questions are not the questions, it's that we begin to live in that world where we cannot live life because we're always thinking about, what if I would have done something different? What if I would have made a different choice? And to live in that world, we'll never be able to grow in our faith and become what God wants us to become. So I would say, number one, write down the questions. And then I'm going to suggest later on, I might as well go ahead and say it now, if you have had confrontation with people, maybe who have passed on, I recommend to people, you write them a note. You write it down as if you're writing. If I needed to say something to my wife, I would write down, "Dear Laura." Now, you may, when I say what I'm about to say, y'all may think I'm the weirdest person you've ever met. And I've got a long list of people who could tell you that that's true. So, but when I go to the cemetery, I talk to my wife at the cemetery. And somebody said, "Do you think she can hear you?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I mean, there's some implication that people who are gone on can know what's going on the earth. But here's what I do know. I do know that God can hear me, and I talk to him too, and I know he can hear me. And if heaven is what I think it is, even if she can't hear me, maybe he'll tell her what I'm saying." And so write down what you want to say to the person, and then you hold on to that, and that might be of help.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Anybody else? Sure, go ahead.
You touched briefly on the bitter. You can use it to become bitter or better. You know, you even use the example to the degree of, hey, you know, you should be over this by now. To the person that is bitter, how can we, as their friends or the church, help? And should we expect some bitterness? Can we grow
Sure.
from bitterness? Or
Yeah,
is that
I think everybody's going to go through different stages of grief, and I think there's going to be a time when you're going to be angry, you know. If you read the book of Habakkuk, for instance, it's a little 3-chapter book in the Old Testament that we don't hear very much about.
We're preaching through it right now.
You are?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to say, and y'all can tell me if he said it right. Okay?
It's not about me today, Jim.
I believe Habakkuk was angry at God. I believe he was angry at God. And he pretty much told God he was angry. As a matter of fact, what he told God in chapter 1 is, "God, I've been talking to you, I've been praying about this, and you don't seem to be doing anything about it. And the idea is, I don't think you're hearing what I'm saying." And then God responded to Habakkuk, and basically God said, "Habakkuk, I've been doing something. You don't have any clue what I'm doing. And if I tried to explain it to you, you wouldn't understand it." And then that famous verse is Habakkuk 2, verse 4, that says, the just shall live by faith. So I think bitterness is part of grief, and I think people will always deal with it. And I don't think there's any aspect of grief that you can say that is wrong.
okay?
But if that becomes who you are, if it changes the makeup of who you are, everybody's going to deal with pain and anger and heartache and bitterness, but you don't want to live in that for a long time. And so I have a friend who lost her son in a car wreck not long after he had married, and this has been probably 9 years ago now, and she's still angry at God. And she says to me, it's hard for me to walk into the church building. Well, maybe, I don't know how long that time lasts. For some people, it's going to last longer than it does for others. But it seems to me there's got to be some time where we resolve that bitterness and that anger to some degree to be able to move ahead with life. And one of the things that we need to remember is that every choice and every decision that we make in life doesn't affect just us, but it affects other people around us. And so what I would do with somebody who seems to not be able to get over that bitterness is to spend time praying with them, to say, pour out your feelings, tell me why you're bitter, tell me everything that's going on, and just listen. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen to people. We think that we've got to fix everybody and we've got to have an answer to everything, when sometimes there's just not an answer.
Right.
And so we listen to people, we pray with them, and we just let them know that we're here for them. There may come a day that there needs to be some kind of intervention with people who are closest to them and say, we love you, we do, we've been here for you, we'll always be here for you, but we want to help you move on with your life.
Have you ever been a part of an intervention?
I have, yes I have, yeah. A number of different times through the years. And some of the times it's been very helpful and worked.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's turned people against other people. But we got to try to do something, I think, to help somebody who's dealing with bitterness over a long period of time. And I think the key would be praying with them and just being willing to listen to them.
I've got one thing real quick. When you mentioned how relationships change, and there's a cycle, it seems like every time someone loses a loved one, I think back to, I was 13 when my dad passed away, and it seemed like so many people were there for about 2 weeks, maybe 3. And then it felt like they kind of vanished, which I know that's not fair to say, but that's how it seemed.
Sure.
I don't know if this is really a question so much as just maybe you can elaborate on, is it fair to say when those people begin to kind of fade away, they stop coming around, your friend stopped calling after calling you every day for 3 months, is there responsibility that lies with the grieving, if there is a need, or if you wonder where did they go, to reach out to those people and communicate the needs that we still have? And I don't want to seem unfair in this, but
No, I think there is. Again, that's one of those things that's easier to talk about than it is to do.
true.
Because I wasn't going to call my friend. Maybe I should have. I probably should have, but I wasn't going to do that just
Sure.
because I didn't know what was going on. And I think some relationships will change drastically where there won't be a relationship, a friendship there anymore. And so what do you do with that? Well, you find new friends, right? You build new relationships. And through the years in ministry, Rock, every time we've moved, we've had to redo that. So when your children, are young, when they're kids, you have friends with people who have children who are kids. My daughter, for a little while, dated a guy that we were friends with the parents, and that didn't go well, and we lost the friendship, which was okay in the big scheme of things. But the point is that our relationships are going to change, and so we may have to form new relationships. Sure. And it hurt. That's not to mean it doesn't hurt. It hurts if you were close to somebody. There were people, when I lost my wife, there were people who I heard from who had been friends in the past that I had not heard from in years, and it kind of rekindled a friendship. There are other people who were really close to that I didn't hear as much from, and that kind of changed that relationship as well. And that, in some ways, is on the person who is grieving, but to me, there's nothing you could do about that.
Yeah.
I don't think the burden of keeping relationships initially, particularly initially, is on the person who is grieving.
Sure.
I think in the long term, they may want to try to do something,
Yeah. What I think of, it's common for people to say, if you need anything, let me know.
yeah,
And I think I try to find a balance in when is it on the grieving to say, okay, I do have this need, I'm going to let that person know. When you're in the grief, you also don't think about that. I don't think most of the time, but that's just a common thing I think that say, if you need anything, let me know. And sometimes we feel like, well, where did this person go? Why are they not coming around?
Right.
And it may simply be they're not aware that you have that need.
right.
It kind of reminds me of, sometimes I'm not aware that Elena has a need for me to help her fold clothes and wash dishes.
Yeah.
But if she says, hey, will you help me fold clothes? I'm willing,
Yeah.
but it doesn't dawn on me that the need is there.
So, Brock, I'd say that's a spiritual problem. I don't know if all right. I'm kidding about that.
No, yeah, I
but yeah,
understand.
I think there is a time when the person who is grieving ought to get to a point to where they can take initiative on things. But when that time comes, I'm not sure.
Right. Okay.
I think part of that is we think of the grief being initially, in most cases, we're talking about, when someone passes. Now, you said, you lost some friends and had to grieve that, and they didn't pass away, and we forget that there was a grieving process that.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, you said anniversaries, and you've said a couple of times 28 months yesterday.
Yeah.
And the grief is perpetual.
Right.
So
Yeah, it never goes away. I don't think you ever quit thinking about. I have a friend who got married. He lost his wife, and he got married to a woman who had lost her husband. And he told me, we're recording this, right?
Yes.
No, I'm sure they won't see this. He said, all we do is sit around and talk about our mate. That's all we do. And I thought, well, of course that's what you do. You were married to your wife for 40 years. She was married to her husband for 40 years. I had another man who came to me, an older gentleman, and he said, he had lost his wife, and he said, I'm getting married to this woman. Would you do the wedding? And he was an elder in the church at one point, and several years older than I was. And I said to him, Hubert, now, I do weddings for people, but I always require pre-marriage counseling. And he said, well, we want to come and talk to you about it. I was kind of joking. They knew much more about marriage than I did. But they came to talk to me, and I said, tell me about your life. And come to find out, she had lost two husbands. She had two husbands who had passed away. And I said, Hubert, I just got one question. You sure you want to marry this woman? I mean, you might be number 3 quick. But so I think, it never goes away. I think it'll always be there. We learn to live with it, I think. And hopefully that we come to a point in our life where our grief doesn't weigh us down and weigh other people down. I said earlier, by nature, I'm a positive person, and I don't love to talk about what we're talking about today. I don't love to talk about it. I love to talk about my wife. I'll talk about her as much as anybody wants to, but I don't love talking about this. And I don't talk about it all the time, believe it or not, because I want to be able to be with people and have relationships with people where the grief doesn't, get into the way of building the relationship. Yes, sir.
What if you're a person that just kind of by nature keeps things inside?
Yeah.
Don't like to talk about things
Yeah.
that happen, especially grief.
Yeah.
And you just think over time, maybe this hurt will go away.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about it.
So first of all, I understand that because I'm by nature a very private person. I don't tell everything to people. I have some friends who are in ministry that talk about everything. They're very open, and I have not been that kind of person. And many times, even after the passing of my wife, I've kept it in and not talked to people about it. but I think there's something that is helpful to talk about it if I can make myself do that. I heard a fellow say years and years ago that you can't feel your way into an action, but you can act your way into a feeling. And so if I can force myself to do some things that are out of my comfort level, it might make me feel differently about that. That's not an easy thing to do, and particularly if that's your nature. But there may be times that I have to make myself do some things that I would not normally do just to see if that will help. Now, if keeping it in doesn't cause any issues in other relationships and even with your own life, then that may be okay. But I think that we eventually have to get to a point where we wonder, is if my keeping this in and not talking about it affecting me in other relationships? And if I could force myself to do something that I normally wouldn't do, will it help strengthen those relationships? I wish there was an easy answer to that question, but I think that the best answer is that sometimes I need to know I can't feel my way into an action, but maybe I can act my way into a feeling. Yes, ma'am.
When my son first got sick, I started keeping a journal of his medical care because I thought we might want to refer to that, and we did often. But I just continued to keep that, and then after he passed, wrote about things, and a lot of things that I couldn't say to people, or that was so private I couldn't express, I wrote down.
Yes, ma'am.
And so I've continued to write that journal, and on days that are hard, I can write about how I'm feeling, and it's not going to bother anybody else or other things. So if somebody is having trouble expressing themselves and you don't want to share it with other people, you could write it down, and you can say whatever you want to in your private journals.
And I think that's a great idea, and I've done that in my life, and I encourage other people to do that. Write down your feelings. I said earlier, even if you have feelings about somebody who has passed on, write a note to that person, and that might help as well. So that is another solution to the idea of I just don't feel comfortable talking to people. Thank you for that.
You talked about intervention earlier, and we've talked about, Dennis asked that about being, if you're self-within. So my question is, when should we be self-aware enough that maybe we need to go see some sort of counselor?
Yeah.
If there is an answer to that.
That may be something that other people have to help us with, have to kind of recommend to us. In our congregation, what we do is when somebody loses a loved one, we take them a package of information, ways the church can help, and we let them know that we have counselor not on our staff, but we have a counselor on retainer who helps people with that. And if you need this, it's available to you. And so I think early on, you let people know that's a possibility. It's okay to talk to somebody if you need to. And I might be the person, you might be the person to talk to them, but they may need deeper kind of counseling that I can't provide. And so I think early on you say to people, if you need somebody to talk to, let us know. But then after a course of time, if they don't do it, and you feel like they need to, you might remind them again. It's okay to go to counseling. So I don't always agree with counselors, but I am very, very thankful for them because I think they provide expertise in areas that common people don't understand. And so I highly recommend that. And the time period, again, I think the most difficult thing in any of these things we're talking about is to try to put a time on it. I don't think we can do that. And the reason is because, as we said, everybody is different. Right. And so somebody may be ready for that the day after their mate dies. Somebody might not be ready for that for several years.
this is about 15 after.
Yeah, let's take a
We're-
break.
We're gonna take a break. What time do you wanna get started at? So take
15 minutes, yeah.
Let's take 15 minutes. Before y'all do, I want to mention to everyone, that I have a copy. I think we have enough for everyone here of Jeff's book. And, it is from the perspective of him losing a spouse, but I think there's value in this for everyone in here. And you can also, after you've read through it, you might bless someone else who's in need of it. We also have these flash drives which have copies of sermons. Lowell Williams, who is also a preacher, and he lost his wife, and I believe shortly after he shared his emotions and his process with his congregation through the form of sermons and classes and things like that, and we have those on here, so if you'd like a copy of that, we have these available as well. So before you get out of here today, make sure you get your copy of this book and the sermons from Lowell Williams if you'd like that. So let's break until about 10:30. Help us eat the coffee cakes that we have out there, drink some of that coffee, and fellowship with each other. If you are watching on Facebook, we're gonna pause at this point and we'll pick back up when we start the second session.
I love your soul, man. You're just, I feel like I've known you a long time.
I was
Just
gonna say
from
the same
stuff.
thing. I
Yeah.
feel like talking to you out there. I feel like we've been friends for a long time.
It's awesome, man. I like that. I like
I
that.
like it too.